Hello, I'm Kirsty Young, and this is a podcast from the Desert Island Discs archive. For rights reasons, we've had to shorten the music. The programme was originally broadcast in 2007. My castaway this week is George Michael. For more than 25 years, he's been an international star. More than 100 million records sold, countless number ones, armfuls of prestigious awards, and an army of loyal fans. His ability to write, produce and perform perfect pop songs is unquestioned. But along with the career highs, there have been lows too. He lost a long wrangle with his record company, faced bereavement, and for years his sexuality was a matter of intense newspaper speculation until he was spectacularly outed a decade ago. Within a few years, he said, he lost his lover, lost his mother, and lost his dignity. Just because you're rich and famous, he once said, doesn't mean your life is problem-free. My problems are not any greater or lesser than when I was 17. They're just different. So, George Michael, we're about to cast you away on this imaginary desert island. Would you welcome the solitude?
Right now I would, actually. Right now I would, because I've obviously just done a year's touring, which was closely followed by some community service. So I'm quite ready to be on my own for a while.
I mean, it's been an extraordinary 12 months. You finished this tour, which was a sellout, was a smash hit, got great reviews. You opened the new Wembley Stadium. The day before that, you were standing in the dock of Brent Magistrates Court, charged with driving whilst unfit through drugs. I mean, have these 12 months seemed almost unbelievably extreme?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's been... actually, it's been a bizarre year. It's been a very bizarre year because you can't imagine what it is like playing to people who've been loyal to you for 25 years and haven't seen you for 15. That's just been the most life-affirming thing I could have done. I'm so glad I did it. And yet on the other side, I feel like, you know, it's been shown to me time and time again, and very, very strongly recently, that the truth is nothing like as important as a good story, you know.
Do the stories matter to you? I mean, given that you have been, as I said in the introduction, very, very famous for quite a long time now, do you still get buffeted by the headlines?
Well, I don't like people thinking that I've been done for grass and other drugs when I've been done for sleeping pills. But I can't do anything about the fact that the story lasts longer than the fact that you've told people it didn't happen, you know. When I realised it was that one-sided and that really me telling people the truth wasn't going to make any difference, I've managed in the last 18 months to master the art of not reading them, which I should have done 20 years ago, really.
So those have been the low bits of the last 12 months. You said quite a while back when you decided not to tour again, you said, you know, if I wanted adulation, I'd tour. Yeah. I don't want adulation. Yeah. Has a little bit of adulation been quite nice?
Well, it's not the adulation that's been nice. It's the absolute warmth, actually. It's the complete generosity. I genuinely believe that, you know, the purpose of what I do is a positive one. You know, I really do genuinely believe that most of my songs are life-affirming in some way, you know, and that actually people who don't care about your music thinking lots of things about you that aren't true, it really doesn't matter. You know, it really doesn't matter. And what's wonderful is that a lot of them that do think they're true really don't care. So, you know, I'm such a lucky man. It's so annoying to have people try and give the impression that the world is a totally screwed up place. And I really needed those people in front of me night after night to tell me that it wasn't. You know, I really needed it so badly, and I'm so grateful to them.
Tell me about your first choice.
This is the best female vocalist I've heard in my entire career. And one of the best writers. So all I can say is please, please understand how brilliant you are. And I wish her every success in the future. And I know she can get past the media. I don't know if she can get past other things, but she's a fantastic talent and we should support her.
This is Amy Winehouse. Amy Winehouse and Love is a Losing Game. George Michael, you were saying intriguingly when we were listening to that, your great admiration for her talent, and you were talking about the fact that for yourself, you've never really been sure about anything in your life apart from the fact that you had the ability to create music that people wanted. To explain more about that, because that's very interesting.
Well, I'll tell you, this is a really... I've never said any of this before, but it's odd. I'm just kind of ridiculously ready to say these things now. But I have a huge propensity for guilt because I was the boy in a Greek family who could do what he liked from a very early age, and did.
Because the culture in the family was to indulge
the culture was patriarchal, and it was to indulge the boy. I have two wonderful sisters who never got their way as young Greek girls, obviously. And I grew up with this terrible feeling of guilt. I had feelings of guilt as a small child, knowing that I was always the one that was going to get the easy ride. And I carried that propensity for guilt in strangest ways, and I think I've finally realised one of the reasons my life has been so extreme and it's felt so, in some ways, self-destructive, is that, it sounds arrogant, but I never had any feeling that my talent was going to let me down. I had a feeling that I had a huge advantage over a lot of other people in the industry and a lot of other people in my own life, obviously, that I love and care about very much. And I think, in a strange way, I've spent much of the last 15 or 20 years trying to derail my own career because it never seems to suffer. I suffer like crazy. I suffer all around it. I've suffered terrible things, obviously bereavements and public humiliations and blah, blah, blah. But my career just seems to always right itself like a duck in a bath, like a plastic duck in a bath. And I think in some ways I resent that.
When you were very, very young, you decided you wanted fame. I mean, it was a very deliberate strategy by
Absolutely.
you.
But by the time I was 22 or 23, I knew that I was chasing something that was making me unhappy.
Can we rewind a little bit then to childhood? Your father was a Greek Cypriot immigrant, first generation. Your mother was born in England, as you say. You were the last of 3 children. What was life like growing up?
My father was the absolute archetypal, 1950s immigrant from Cyprus, very determined, and every single member of his family made something of themselves in this country. They're a typical immigrant family that worked their asses off and reaped the rewards.
And so he started off as a waiter and ended up having his own restaurant and running his own business successfully.
Very successfully, and moved us out of a very working class environment into a middle class one. That didn't seem so incongruous because my mother, strangely enough, found out when her mother died that her mother had in fact been Jewish. So actually her origins weren't English, but she was incredibly Victorian because her mother had been disowned for marrying a Gentile, but her mother came from a very wealthy Jewish family. And my mother carried with her some very Victorian ideas that really did not go at all well with my father's upwardly mobile. My mother absolutely had no ambition for money, thought money was the root of all evil. So being half my mother and half my father genetically was never going to be an easy ride.
So much to talk about. Tell me about your second record.
Roxy Music. At both ends of the spectrum, Bryan Ferry's made some of the sexiest music of the last 30 years. It's so original and it's so sexy and it's so insistent, I suppose.
Roxy Music and Do the Strand, not particularly chosen, George, because you were playing that when, you must have been 9 or 10 when that came out.
Yeah, that didn't actually stop me from listening to the best Elton John and the best Queen records. But something strange happened. At the age of about 8, I had a head injury, and I know it sounds bizarre and unlikely, but it was quite a bad bang. I had it stitched up and stuff. But all my interests changed. Everything changed in 6 months. I had been obsessed with insects and creepy crawlies. I used to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and go out into this field behind our garden and collect insects before everyone else got up. And suddenly, all I wanted to know about was music. It just seemed a very, very strange thing. And I have a theory that maybe it was something to do with this accident, because they had this whole left brain, right brain thing. Nobody in my family seemed to notice, but I became absolutely obsessed with music, and everything changed after that.
So when you were in your early to mid-teens, you met a friend called Andrew Ridgeley, and famously, of course, you would go on to form Wham, and you were about 17 when Wham had its first hit, which was very, very young indeed.
Well, no, I think we were 18. I'd just turned 18 when we got signed, and I think we were still 18 by the time we had the first record out. And
that must have been a very big deal, getting signed. Can you remember?
Oh my God, I had £500. I'd never been more flush, and I thought £500 was quite a good deal for 30 years, actually. So considering I'm really only just free of that original contract now.
So you signed away, in essence, your creative life in that first deal?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And apparently that's okay.
Can you remember what you spent that first £500 on?
It took a long time to spend it. That's the shocking thing. When you've just given up your job at the cinema, £500 is like, I went into that office and gave up that job as though I'd just become a diamond dealer. So yeah, everything's relative, isn't it? It took me a while to spend it, yeah.
And you were born Yorios Kyriakos Panayotou, Was that okay? Say it for me.
Yorgos Kyriago Banayoldu. That was very good. All you have to do is kind of soften all the consonants. If you say Yorgos Kyriago Banayoldu, that's it. Whereas it reads Georgios Kyriakos Panayotou.
Right, that's sort of what I said.
And there is a very urgent need for a stage name when you're 18, and that's your destiny.
So George Michael the name was a creation, but was the persona a creation at 17?
Well, I thought it was. At some point I realised, everything you do is you, even if it's the lies you tell. Even if it's an act, it's the part of the real me, isn't it? Because it's what I want people to think I am.
Tell me about your next record.
Number 3 is Gnarls Barkley. I think it sold 50% of all singles in the first 6 months of last year. And that's really saying something, An amazing song is an amazing song. Occasionally, something left of field comes through and people see it for what it is, which is one of those old classics, the kind of records we used to hear quite often. And it stands head and shoulders above everything else.
Gnarls Barkley and Crazy. It's very interesting, your selection, as we'll see as we go through here, George Michael, that you have chosen very contemporary music. You don't seem to be somebody who's harking back to the musical past. Is that because you always want to be on top of things, or is it because you're tired of what's gone before? Not at
all. I'm not on top of things at all. In fact, I was actually just telling you, it's something fairly tragic for someone who's lived for the radio, but since I don't have a licence, I don't listen to the radio anymore because I listen to the radio in the car. So for the next 2 years, my radio listening is probably going to be a bit slim.
They still play a lot of you, of course. You are, I understand, the most played artist on British radio. Those early days of Wham, when you were very, very young and you were pumping out those hits, things like Wham Rap and Club Tropicana, Wake Me Up Before You Go, Last Christmas, a great big long line of them. What was life like, going from being this boy who wanted fame to this boy who suddenly got it and then some?
Well, for a while it was just absolutely magical. Playing out, and with your best mate, playing out your fantasies. It was just a dream, obviously. But no, I think what I was doing was I was supremely confident that I was writing pop classics, to be honest with you. But I was also supremely aware that if I kind of left the imagery a little bit more to Andrew, kids kind of loved it.
You said also a moment ago that you were living out your fantasies. What were your fantasies that you were living out in the Wham days?
Well, I don't want to tell you all of them.
Go on.
But I think the image that stuck in my head of what I wanted to be was David Cassidy came to England for the first time. And there was a shot that stuck with me more than anything else. There was a shot of him in slow motion heading a football around on the top of the LWT building. They then panned over the side of the LWT building and there were just thousands of these girls screaming, obviously, but they couldn't get to him. There was all that adulation and they couldn't get to him. And somehow my desire for safety, because I was quite an insecure child, and my desire for fame were kind of locked up in that moment.
The insecurity that you were talking about there, that did not come from the insecurity about being able to write these platinum-plated pop songs. The insecurity came from what? The way you looked?
Just from who I was. It wasn't like I had found it hard to make friends. I made plenty of friends. I just, I had no physical confidence whatsoever. And I looked up to Andrew on such a level because he just oozed confidence out of every pore. And then suddenly we were massively successful. And I went from being Andrew's kind of shadow as a sexually confident being to being really in the centre of attention. And at that level, somehow I lost all my confidence. I suppose also the realisation that bisexuality was no longer a reality for me, and I suddenly felt like a fake. So the whole thing just turned me into someone who really felt the camera was my enemy.
Let's talk about that in just a moment. For now, though, tell me about your fourth choice.
My fourth choice is Nirvana. This record is the best produced rock record in the history of rock, I think. It's not necessarily the greatest song, it's a phenomenal record. Obviously, it was a music industry changing record. It changed everything in America overnight, because it's an absolute classic.
And Smells Like Teen Spirit, we came out of that just in time there, George Michael. You were starting to headbang, and you were saying if you were on an island, you'd be angry anyway, so that would be the perfect
If I was
one.
on an island, I'd be so furious. I think I'd need to vent anger every once in a while. Do you know what I mean?
Oprah Winfrey once said, if you come to fame not knowing who you are, it will define you. And I'm wondering that given that Wham and fame hit you so early, did you begin to be a little disorientated by that magnitude of fame?
There's a level of deification in America that you just don't get over here. You get quite the opposite over here, don't you? For an English boy, that was kind of... I was 24 and still quite afraid, or still not knowing, to be honest with you, how to spend money. I was terrified of my lifestyle maybe removing my ability to connect to what I did. And I freaked out. I said, I don't want to make any more videos. I don't think I'll ever tour again. I have to step back.
To those of us buying your records at the time and watching the videos, it was a very, very heterosexual image. I mean, I remember...
I think so.
I really did think so. When I watched the
you
video...
women, honestly.
When I watched the video to I Want Your Sex, I thought that man is clearly a very heterosexual
Oh, I
man.
see, yeah. Well, there was I was with Kathy in the video, and this was basically...
And you weren't having a cup of tea, let's just...
No, absolutely not. Absolutely. And this was, it wasn't as though it was a complete lie. It's not that I had stopped having sex with women, but I was already fully aware that in itself was a lie, because what I really had made a connection to was an emotional part of my sexuality, and that was clearly gay. So there was all that feeling fraudulent as well, because I'm not... I think what people have to acknowledge, if they know my behaviour since I've come out, or since I outed myself accidentally, but probably not accidentally, I think there's a level of honesty that's quite obviously natural to me, that I'm uncomfortable with anything else. So I try to understand, firstly, how much I love my family, and that AIDS was the predominant feature of being gay in the 80s and early 90s, as far as any parent was concerned. And my mother was still alive, and every single day would have been a nightmare for her, thinking about what I might be subjected to. So yeah, there were all these kind of reasons. And
were you out to some people and not out to other people?
Oh, yeah. Because I've been out to a lot of people since I was 19. I wish to God it had happened then, I have to be honest. I don't think I would have had the same career. My ego might not have been satisfied in some areas quite as much, but I think I would have been a happier man.
Did you wrestle with it around about the age of 19?
Yeah, when I was 19, I came out to various friends and one of my sisters, and I said I was going to talk to my mum and dad, and was persuaded in no uncertain terms that it really wasn't the best idea.
By who?
By friends, but they weren't really... I don't think they were trying to protect my career or their careers. I think they were literally just thinking of my dad. Because, when you're 19, that's as far as you look at your parents, you say, oh, don't tell your dad. My God, your dad will hit the roof. And then very soon after that, everything changed. AIDS was just not something I was prepared to bring into my parents' life. I was too young and too immature to know that I was sacrificing as much as I was.
Tell me about your next record.
So the next record, quite appropriately, is Being Boring by Neil Tennant and Chris Lowe, Pet Shop Boys. Neil Tennant, at a certain point in the 80s, was writing the most beautiful songs. No one wants to hear frightening, terrifying songs about AIDS, but they do, if they're gay and they've lost friends, they do want to hear those people referred to and remembered and honoured. And I think some of Neil's work did that beautifully.
Shop Boys and Being Boring. It's interesting, George Michael, that you haven't chosen any of your own songs.
Oh, did I not? Actually, I'd probably just listen to my own songs on a desert island to remind myself that I was once known and famous, because I'd be explaining it to crustaceans, wouldn't I?
One of the most poignant songs I think you've written is Jesus to a Child, and that was written for essentially your first love. Mm-hmm. How did you meet your first love?
Well, what happened was actually... It was a strange thing. I don't know if people will relate to this, but there have only been 3 times in my life that I've really fallen for anyone. And each time, on first sight, I had something has clicked in my head that told me I was going to know that person. And it happened with Anselmo across a lobby. So I met him in that lobby, and I didn't understand why the click happened. This is a man in a Brazilian hotel. I'm never going to see him again. Why did that happen? I didn't understand what was going on. This was the first love of my entire life. This was the first person I ever shared my life with. It was tragic that I lost him, but it was a wonderful, wonderful experience meeting him.
How old were you then?
I was 27... and I just started my first proper relationship, which is pretty old, isn't it, really? Unfortunately, within 6 months, I knew that he was terminally ill. So it was a very strange first love. It was very distorted by the situation, but it was also a wonderful experience,
And so he died in, was it 1993?
1993, that's right.
And it was an AIDS-related illness.
About 3 months before I lost my court case, yes.
Right.
So it was not a good year.
Right.
It was age-related, yeah. I mean, he was a couple of years older than me. He very likely picked it up in New York before people had any inkling that New York was actually a hotbed of this new disease.
One of the signatures of being truly and deeply in love, of course, is that you want to sing about it from the rooftops. You want to tell everyone. I mean, how open were you about the love affair?
Well, see, unfortunately, I wasn't writing anything. I'd already just released an album when I met him, and then by the time I actually made another album, he died, which is what the album was about. And to be perfectly honest, I think my best album, I think it probably will always be my best album, and I never want to be that inspired again, as I say to people, you know.
That's a very bittersweet situation, isn't it, that your most creative period, something that, and also one of your most popular albums, older, is something that came out of such pain. Can you reconcile those two feelings, or will they always be a degree of dissonance between them?
No, I think I think the album is a beautiful reminder of him. I wouldn't go through it again to make a great album. Don't get me wrong. You know, this man's life was much more important to me than entertaining people. I never want to feel that loss. I'd never want to feel that depth of emotion again. I hope he's very, very proud of it somewhere.
Tell me about your next record.
Next record, Goldfrapp. That first Goldfrapp album, Felt Mountain, is a great, great album, you know. It's amazingly elegant production. I'm a real admirer of her voice.
And Paper Bag. You mentioned just a moment ago, and indeed it's been something of a theme. It was at the beginning, the derision with which you talk about record companies and record executives. Mm-hmm. You had this big, nasty high court battle with Sony that lasted about 6 months, I think it was. Were you propelled by anger about different things into that? Was it actually all about the record company?
Well, I mean, I did sign a piece of paper, aged 18, that effectively, considering I've only been able to be sold rather than be free, effectively, the results of that deal have only just ended. I'm just free.
You called it at the time professional slavery, which of course was a beautifully calculated, well-turned phrase. But if at the same time, which may have been the contention of your record company, you didn't particularly want to put yourself out there, you didn't want to go on the radio shows and go on the TV shows and make the videos in the you know, in the sharp suit looking great, you didn't want to do any of that. They might reasonably have been expected to respond by saying, well, we won't really play the game either.
Well, actually, if what they really reasonably could have expected was, when you just made $200 million for a company, you expect them to have a little bit of patience with you, you know? It was very obvious that I was going through something personal that meant I couldn't face the world. What I was actually going through personally was dealing with the fact that the person I cared for most in the world had a terminal illness, and I didn't know how long that terminal illness would be. I didn't know when I would ever be happy enough to write another song. I was terrified. I was absolutely terrified. At that point in time, I had no idea what to do. And it was such a dark period of my life, and I thought it was just going to continue that way. I really did. So I struggled with huge depression, especially after my mother died. I struggled with huge depression, and there's a bad combination here. There's someone who doesn't take bereavement very well. I don't think any of us do, but some of us, I think, take longer to recover than others. And there's a situation where you're your own boss, so no one's kicking you up the arse to get out there and live again and see the positive, you know. But 2 bereavements, losing a lover and your mother within the space of 3 years, is a tough one.
Let's take a break for your 7th record.
There are 2 reasons I've chosen this record. There are certain records that literally I just can't not move to, and this is one of them. The lyric makes me laugh. It's completely brutal, completely sexist. Surprise, surprise, coming from an American hip-hop record. But it's funny. It is funny.
That was Kanye West and Gold Digger. Did you come to a point after you were, well, intriguing that you said not really forcibly outed, but, you know, the happening that everybody knows about. It wasn't just on every front page. It was on every front page for about 10 days. You were in the park in LA, as everybody knows, and in the toilet you were busted by a policeman undercover because of sexual advances you made to him. You were forced to come out. Yeah.
Well, what were you going to do? Say it was a one-off?
Right.
In my case, you know, I always knew it was going to happen sometime. I was going to get outed one way or another. And the reason it took me a good year to admit to myself that it was subconsciously deliberate.
I read that you said, and of course because I read it, I don't necessarily know if it's true, but that it would not have happened
If my mother had been alive.
If your mother had been alive?
No, it would never have happened.
Why?
I'm not saying the cruising wouldn't have happened. I'm saying I would never have put myself in the stupid position of doing it in America, where I knew the level of homophobia. I think for me to do that, I was absolutely tempting fate. I think I was sick of The Secret. Now that there wasn't any reason to be quiet, now that my mother was no longer in this world, and I was proud of my sexuality. Strange way of going about telling the world. But I think it was almost like it had to be that. The battle I'd played with the press was so much one of privacy, and I felt so loath to actually sit and say, I am gay, the three words they'd wanted for years. It really wasn't something that needed holding on to anymore, but I just couldn't do it in the regular way. I think I had to do it and fool myself. I had to fool myself that had been dragged out of me.
Did you feel that a burden had been lifted?
Oh, God, yeah. Because I'm not a liar. I'm too honest to dye my hair. I'm too embarrassed to dye my hair. I'm not a liar, you know. But this was one lie that I'd been kind of trying to tell people in my own way for years and years. And I don't know, something in me picked the most difficult way to do it.
When you were talking to me about your mother at the very beginning of this conversation, you said that she was very Victorian in her values. How did she react when you had come out to her?
Oh, well, you see, when I came out to my mother, I wrote her a letter the day after Anselmo died because it seemed absolutely simple. It seemed like if there was a message at the moment of his death, it was, well, this is when you tell your parents, because this is the only part of yourself that you haven't opened up.
What about the recent pain then? As you mentioned, you no longer have a driving licence, and for 2 years you won't be able to drive because you were found... Now, it's reported, and you do take issue with a lot of the reporting on this, that you were found slumped at the wheel of your car, you were incapable of driving, you were found guilty of that. You've done community service for that. How long did you do for community service?
I've done half of my community service. I did some very interesting work with people with mental health problems and with... people with drug addiction, and I also, scrubbed down some very dirty rooms and made chicken fajitas for some homeless people, which was nice. I was quite good, apparently, even though it was my first time with chicken fajitas.
Do you think you have a problem with drugs?
It depends what you call a problem, really. I'm a happy man, and I can afford my marijuana, so that's not a problem. I'm constantly trying to smoke less, really. I would like to take, absolutely I would like to take less, no question. To that degree, it's a problem, yeah. Is it a problem in my life? Is it getting in the way of my life in any way? I don't think so, I really don't think so.
You said a little earlier that this is a time in your life when, probably unlike any other, you found peace and a degree of contentment, and you've been back on the road with all the attention that has garnered. What do you think it is, essentially, that's brought you that peace?
I think, well, in all honesty, nobody died on me in years. It took years for me to believe that these blows weren't going to keep coming.
Tell me about your final record.
Actually, this is the heaviest lyrical record on this list, and it's from a gay artist called Rufus Wainwright, and he's written this song called Going to a Town, really laying into the Bush administration, talking about America, soaking the body of Jesus Christ in blood. Fantastic lyrics all over this record, and someone that people should definitely check out.
Right, and Going to Town. So at this point on the island, I will give you George Michael, the Bible, the complete works of Shakespeare, and you're allowed to take another book. What would you like to take? I'd
take any book of... If I'm getting the Bible,
yes,
right, I'm getting Shakespeare, which I won't read, by the way.
Okay.
I'm not going to take a jolly book, but I think I would take a book of short stories by Doris Lessing.
You may have that then. And of course you're allowed a luxury on this island to make things more bearable. What would your luxury be?
Well, I've thought about this. And obviously you're not allowed to have a partner, so I couldn't take Kenny.
No. So
that's out. But on a desert island, who is going to know I've not got a driving licence? So I can drive around in a DB9 I'll just drive around and around my little desert island on my DB9 because I'm obsessed with cars. And, next 2 years I'm not going to get to drive one.
It's yours. And if the waves were to crash to the shore and threaten to wash away these 8 discs that you've chosen, what's the one you would run to save?
Oh, my God. I think I'd have to say Amy Winehouse.
You can have it. George Michael, thank you very much for letting us hear your Desert Island
Thank you,
Discs.
Kirsty. Thank you so much.